Okay, I want to give you today a little bit of an introduction to William Wordsworth, whose poetry we're going to be reading this week and next week. He is, as I said, a poet. He's also considered to be the father of English Romanticism, which is the movement of poetry and literature that we're going to be talking about throughout the coming weeks. So just a quick biography on William Wordsworth, and as you can see I have a picture there for you of him. He was born in 1770, and he grew up in a very rural area, much like you would find in this area. Lots of farmland, lots of open land, and as a boy he really grew to love nature, which comes through in his poetry that he writes later in his life. His parents died early in his life by the time he was 13, and so he was exceptionally close to his sister Dorothy. They pretty much grew up together, raised each other, and so throughout his life Dorothy was a major influence. And you're going to find Dorothy referenced in his poetry, so it's important that you understand that brother-sister bond. In the 1790s he lived in France during the Revolution, and while he was there he fell in love with Annette Vallon. He had some issues during the Revolution with justifying the actual revolution that was going on in France, and so because he really questioned what was going on, he was driven to philosophy. He wanted to see what philosophy had to say about the situation that society was in at that point. And there he really had trouble once again with taking what he was reading and relating it to his own personal philosophy. He was faced with harsh realism when it came to the revolution, but his own view of the world was considerably softer. He was much more of a person who was interested in peace, in nature, in the comfort that's found in the natural world. And so, by being in the middle of this revolution in France, and by seeing these harsh realities, it was really difficult for him to kind of put his view in line with how the world actually was during that time. Wordsworth was also the poet laureate until death in 1850. Poet laureate is kind of like the national poetry award. He was considered the national poet. Unusually, he was very popular during this time period. And that's kind of shocking, because at first the critics really didn't care very much for Wordsworth's work. He didn't fit the style of the time, as we're going to find out later in this presentation, and so he really had a lot of bad critical reviews at first. But as he progressed in his career, a lot of common people, just average individuals, really began to follow his poetry, and he did gain popularity. He did gain fame during his lifetime. For poets, that's a big deal, because usually a poet doesn't become popular until after he or she is dead. So Wordsworth got to experience that popularity during his lifetime. He is considered a Lake District poet, so it's important for you to understand what the Lake District is, or was, during that time period. It does still exist today. It is located in England. It is currently a national park in England. And it was very inspirational for Wordsworth, both in his youth and his adulthood. He traveled through the Lake District in his youth, was inspired by nature, but then he also returned to it when he grew older, and he was able to look at nature in a different way, and that really affected him, and you're going to find that in some of the poems that we look at of his. And it wasn't just for Wordsworth. This was considered the cradle of the Romantic movement, so a lot of these Romantic poets that we're going to read were inspired by the Lake District. Just to give you an idea of what they were inspired by, I have a short video clip. It's a current video of the Lake District National Park, but even from this current video, you can only imagine how beautiful it was in the late 1700s, early 1800s, considering it's still extremely beautiful today. So just take a couple of minutes and watch this video. Again, it's short, but I want you to see exactly what was inspiring these Romantic poets. So as you can see, absolutely gorgeous. You can only imagine when you have the gift of poetry and you're already in tune with nature, the inspiration that a place like this might have on you. Okay, one specific work that I do want to focus on for Wordsworth is his book, The Lyrical Ballads, which was done in 1798. It was published with another poet named Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and we are actually going to read a little bit of Coleridge in a few weeks, so you're going to see him again. And this was considered a revolutionary book of poetry. This is where Romanticism kind of got its start. And just to give you an idea of why, this was from the preface to the 1802 edition, and this is Wordsworth writing. There will be found in these volumes little of what is usually called poetic diction. I have taken as much pains to avoid it as others ordinarily take to produce it. Wordsworth created this whole different form of poetry in which he brought it to the common person. He used very common language. Prior to this, poetry was written in a very elevated language, the language of the upper class, the language of the intellectual. Wordsworth brought it down to the common person. And he also focused on themes that were much more nature-based than in previous examples of poetry that tried to focus in more on what I would consider lofty ideals. So Wordsworth shapes this new poetry, and with that, this idea of Romanticism is born. And I just want to give you a little bit of information about Romanticism, because I'm concerned that you may believe that Romanticism has to do with love on some degree. And that's actually not the case. For the Romantic movement, one of the things that we found was this simplicity, this directness of language. So we don't have that high academic language anymore. We're writing for the average person. Romantics were big on feelings, and their poetry contains expressions of spontaneous, intense feelings. Poetry before oftentimes was much more distant, much more separated. The Romantics, however, believed that it was important to get these feelings out, and it was important to express them. And one of the key components of Romanticism is this response to nature, and this idea that we can understand ourselves better by looking at nature, by relating to nature, by spending time in nature. So you're going to find the Romantic poetry simple language, you're going to find a lot of intense feelings, and you're going to find a lot of reflection when it comes to nature and how that can help us to understand ourselves and our world better. So, a few questions for you to answer for this assignment. I want you to think about the video clip of the Lake District, and I want you to be as specific as you can. Why do you think the poets of the Romantic era found that area so inspirational? Draw in particular images that you saw that you might find, if you are a Romantic poet, to be inspirational. The second question is related to Wordsworth's career. As I said earlier, the critics were not particularly fond of him early on, yet his fame and popularity grew. He was poet laureate. I want to know why you think that is. Why do you think he became so popular, even though the critics didn't care for him? As always, please put your answers in the submission block. And if you have any questions, please give me a call or email me. Thanks.